Welcome to Counterpoint. I'm Tanya Granick-Allen. Ontario politicians are getting tour buses decaled and ready, their running shoes dusted off, and their lawn signs printed. Yes, folks, it's that time of year again, election time. On June 2nd, Ontarians will head to the polls to elect a new government or give the current one another kick at the can. One question which is top of mind for many pollsters and voters, for that matter, is what impact will COVID have on the election and election turnout? But besides COVID, there are many other pressing issues we can expect in this election cycle. Housing affordability, inflation, cost of living, healthcare. We will feature a regular Ontario election panel here on Counterpoint, and to help us kick it off, we are joined by Elliot Hughes, Senior Advisor with Summa Strategies and former advisor to Liberal Finance and Defence Ministers, and Yianni Macris, President at Lepanto Group and former Conservative staffer. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm looking forward to diving right in, especially why don't we right off the bat look at some of these poll numbers. Now, I caught a poll recently, a pretty thorough poll by Ipsos, showing that the race, which previously one had thought was, I wouldn't say a runaway, but looked like Ford had a healthy lead, seems to be tightening up. The Ontario Liberals are gaining ground. Elliot, why don't we start with you? Were there any numbers that jumped off the page that are of note?
Well, I think if you had told Stephen Del Duca and the Liberals that they would be within striking distance of Doug Ford, 6 weeks out of the election day, they would have said, we'll take that every day of the week and twice on Sunday. These were good numbers for Del Duca. I would say they were not great numbers for Andrea Horwath and the NDP. That said, I would imagine that the Ford camp was also able to find some silver linings in that Ipsos poll. As well, including sort of pretty high favorability ratings as well. So a little bit for everyone in there, but certainly good news for the Liberals, I think, especially.
Yeah, I found it interesting. You're right. Doug Ford does enjoy a pretty healthy favorability rating. The Liberals seem to have jumped up by about 4 points, according to this poll, but PC's declined some, and of course the NDP, who are the current opposition in the Ontario legislature. Yianni, what were some of your key takeaways from this polling?
Well, I think the number one key takeaway, that Doug Ford and his team can take from it is that the majority of Ontarians actually believe that Doug Ford is the one that's best fit to serve the province as premier. What was interesting is, with the COVID restrictions, which was obviously focused at the voter base in the 416 in downtown Toronto, he actually lost he's trailing by 7 percentage points to Stephen Del Duca, which is rather interesting.
Yes, that would be when we looked at the age cohorts, I found it surprising, and I know some would suggest, well, the younger voters traditionally tend to vote a little center or center left, with the 18 to 34 cohort, which I don't know, I don't write them off as more of a left-leaning voter, because I think that age group is really hungry to know the truth. They do their own research. They're very issues-driven group. So anyhow, the Liberals seem to really enjoy a plethora of support within this group. They're a healthy support group, and again, some of these being first-time voters, I think they're going to really want to exercise their vote. So that was a little surprising. One other interesting takeaway for me, and maybe Elliot, you can jump in, and Yianni, you can share your experience in a moment. But with respect to when this poll broke things down based on vaccine status as well, and I found that interesting. So with those with one or no vaccine status or vaccine dose at all for COVID, 15% said they would vote for other. So that's an interesting cohort. Now, maybe this isn't a big pool to choose from, but 15% would vote for other. So what does that tell you, Elliot?
Well, I think it's a continuation of what we've been seeing at different levels of government in different elections. I think it's something that we saw last federal election in the fall. And it's something that we're seeing play out, I think, internationally as well. We had the French elections yesterday where there was quite a few people abstaining. So you would think that perhaps no one really wanted to vote for either of the candidates. It's a fascinating overlay, the COVID, vaccines and so on onto a population, and I think for pollsters, it's going to be an interesting piece to watch whether or not it actually remains an important, part of how someone decides to vote or not, or have people essentially, and that's sort of the feeling that I'm getting. I'd be keen to hear what you guys think. Or are people sort of feeling, well, we're moving on from COVID and it's no longer really part of our calculus, and that's going to play out in the election and how they vote. It'll be fascinating to watch how that number moves over the next 6-7 weeks.
Yeah, and I want to unpack this just a little bit more after the commercial break, but we've got to go right now. We'll be right back. Welcome back. We have our Ontario election panel because, of course, the Ontario election is just around the corner on June 2nd. And joining me again is Elliot Hughes and Yianni Macris. Yianni, we were just unpacking some of this polling data we've seen. In this case, we're looking at the Ipsos poll. And again, how vaccine status, quantity of doses factors into one's voter intentions. Quite interesting. Elliot, you brought up a good point where, there seems to be a good group of voters who simply want to move on from COVID, whether you're vaxxed or unvaxxed. I think I'd agree with you. I mean, I want to move on from COVID. Yianni, was that part of the Ford strategy with respect to loosening some of these restrictions? I mean, he's received flack for maybe doing too much loosening too soon. Others that, he didn't go fast enough. Why did you even restrict to begin with? How does all of that factor in terms of an election call? Is this helping him or hurting him?
I think it really depends on the demographic that you look at. COVID restrictions and more stringent COVID measures are more popular amongst those who are higher educated, receive higher education, those with master's degrees and PhDs, including youth who certainly tend to fall in the more liberal or NDP voter bloc. But what I really think is interesting is how there's such a large group of people who would vote for kind of none of the above per se. I think that has to do with a lot of COVID fatigue, for lack of a better phrase, and people just being fed up at politicians for, this constant back and forth between opening and closing and reopening and all this uncertainty surrounding COVID. And like you said, I think the population is just ready to move on.
I agree. I want to move on. I'm so fed up of all this. I think I've made that very clear on my program. But, we're apparently in a sixth wave, so we'll see what those numbers, if those numbers spike and we're in the middle of an election, I don't know how well that will be for Premier Ford. So we'll see.
Yeah,
but of course,
can I jump in on that just for 1 second?
Yeah, quickly? No, go for it.
I'm like you. I mean, I want us to move on from COVID. I think everybody wants us to move on. I think the tough thing, though, is leaders sometimes need to make the difficult and, frankly, unpopular decisions that need to be taken when they're thinking about a broader set of issues. So whether that's the health and the economy of Ontarians and the Ontario business sector. So it seems like Premier Ford doesn't really want to have to make that tough call and has sort of made it by not saying anything about it. But sometimes leaders do have to make those tough decisions, even when it might not look very popular.
That's actually a very good point, because I have noticed that, I'm not going to use the word dithering, but there's almost a hesitancy to make a decision, amidst this, some new numbers increasing in terms of ICU admissions and new cases. It's sort of what we all expected would happen in the early days of this election, which still has yet to be called. But decisions are going to have to be made. And, that's why we pay you. That's why we elect you to make those decisions. So it will be interesting to see how, I guess, politics will play into some of these decisions in the weeks ahead. I'm going to be popping popcorn and watching this from home, and because I think it's going to be a very, very interesting election cycle. Not to make light of COVID, though, because I do take it seriously. Okay, let's move on from COVID, because, like I said, I want to move on from COVID. We're going to talk about some of the other elections issues at play. Let's talk about that young voter bloc. Yianni, what do you think is top of mind for the young emerging voters, maybe the 18 to 34 cohort?
Well, like we saw with the federal election, I think housing affordability is still number one top of mind for young voters. The cost of living just keeps going up and up. Inflation skyrockets, and young people are stuck in this position of, am I going to be able to afford to pay my bills, or am I going to be able to look forward to potentially owning a house one day? And I think that's what's number one for that 18 to 30 demographic.
So the Ford government has been in power for 4 years. I could say 4 years ago, we already had a housing affordability issue. Now, maybe thanks to COVID, maybe not thanks to COVID, it's skyrocketed. It's gotten worse. How do you think this issue will play in the election? Meaning, what policies can we expect from the three parties? I mean, we've had the NDP in opposition. Have they done a good enough job holding the Ford government to account? Has Doug Ford's government done enough of a job in helping reduce the stress for young homeowners who are aspiring homeowners?
I think that, for most of fiscal policy falls in the hands of the federal government, especially surrounding interest rates with the Bank of Canada, and setting regulations around various lending practices for the big five or big six banks. I think that the Ford government is trying to put forward a plan to sort of make life more affordable. I mean, we saw that with license plate stickers being eliminated, which is a significant savings for, the average person who's 18 to 30 years old. But I mean, there are multiple different strategies that could be implemented come election time to kind of bring housing to become more affordable.
Okay, I want to hear from you, Elliot, but we've got to cut a commercial break. But you brought up the license plate stickers. I don't know, maybe I'm off here, but I was one of the Ontarians who received that envelope with the check. I think most people see what it is. This is right before an election. We got a rebate. They want our vote, right? Anyhow, we'll pick this up in just a few moments. Welcome back. We're continuing with our election panel as we head into the Ontario election season. The vote, of course, taking place June 2nd. Elliot, we were talking about housing and housing affordability, especially for those trying to enter the market. Again, the Ford government's been in power for 4 years. We've had the NDP in opposition for 4 years. What do you think that the Liberals might bring to the table? What should have been done? What could be done?
Well, I think it's clear that no one has done a good job on housing affordability, whether it's Ford, whether it's Andrea Horwath, and frankly, the Liberals haven't done enough either. So I think I would give failing grades to every party on this issue. And frankly, I don't see Premier Ford talking about this a lot. I see him talking a lot about, cutting people's expenses, whether it's reducing sort of gas taxes, what we just talked about before, the vehicle registrations or reimbursement. Talking a lot about long-term care and healthcare and investing in hospitals. He's not really talking about the housing affordability question. And I wonder if strategically they've decided that this is too hard an issue for us to take head on, and we don't have really the solutions to stop the problem. And let's leave it to the feds to try and solve. And let's just criticize the feds and say the federal government needs to do more on this issue, and instead focus on issues. Other pocketbook issues and healthcare, which is always top of the list, because tackling and solving the housing affordability question is hard and is not going to happen in this next election cycle or probably the next couple of years. This is a structural problem that the entire country faces.
Okay, and I appreciate what you're saying. I still do think that there needs to be more of a will from politicians to do something and not just pass the buck. And I agree,
Yep.
yes, downloading the problem, uploading it to the federal government, it's easy to do, but at the remains of the day, we have, I'm a mom of 5. I'm wondering, am I going to have to pay a down payment for each of my children, even just to potentially afford to live in Ontario? It's shocking when I think of it. Beyond that, when I look at things like the Highway 413, how quickly, zoning and environmental approvals were done to get that zoning going so that they could bring a highway, and I have issues with this highway, I might do a separate show on it, but the 413 highway through some controversial, potentially environmentally protected areas. Where's the will to build more housing, bring more supply in? What happened to that? Yianni, why don't we see more loosening of the red tape for more development?
I think, there's also the big factor of municipal governments. The municipal governments in Ontario tend to fall more left-leaning, you would find. So there is a lot more hesitancy with respect to development around protected areas that are, protected under various environmental statutes, such as wetlands or even the Ontario Greenbelt. So I think there's a lot of, bigger issues at hand that the Ford government, or any provincial government for that matter, needs to take a look at when they're considering these sorts of projects.
Now, you mentioned the environment. Let's talk about some environmental policy. And Yianni, maybe I'll start with you. Ford and his government seems to be shifting a bit more. When they took over from Kathleen Wynne, there was this big anti-carbon tax sentiment that we're going to do all this, we're going to, end the cap and trade and whatnot. But now, I hear the rhetoric changing quite a bit. They weren't successful with the carbon tax. I believe we still have it. And yes, he did give relief on the gas tax. But what policies Why is the Ford government, they seem to be shifting more to a pro-environment policy? What do you think is the impetus with that?
I think first and foremost, there's the issue of who his voter bloc is. The carbon tax has proven to be a lot more popular in Ontario than, let's say, Alberta or Saskatchewan. Alberta being where I used to work, and knowing that, it's a very unpopular policy, even amongst some Liberals in Alberta. I think what the Ford camp has done is looked at, who our voter base is, who do we want to vote for us at this point, which is why you've seen sort of a shift to be more environmentally friendly, per se, in terms of policies.
Do you agree with that, Elliot? Do you think do you think this is a new area that the Ford PC government can fill, that they can fill as being the pro-environment rallying group? Or is this something that really people associate more with the Liberal Party as this is their thing they're championing?
Well, 2 points on that. First, I think the Liberals always wanted to make the environment more of an issue at the provincial level, and the Ford team knew that. And so to, in a sense, head them off at the pass, they needed to look like they were doing more on the issue so that those attacks would be blunted. The second point is the way he's doing it is he's investing in sort of a business-tinged environment policy. So a lot of announcements around EVs,
right.
Which is, a very, key component of, what we need to do to reduce emissions going into the future. But it also has a manufacturing angle to it. It has a jobs angle to it. It has an economic activity angle to it, which allows him to remain on the ground that he's more comfortable with, which is the economy, talking about how the economy is in great shape and how Ontario is going to be leading the country, et cetera.
Welcome back. We're wrapping up our Ontario election panel as we head to the polls June 2nd. Elliot, obviously the economy is always a perennial issue. It's top of mind, especially as we, I think, emerge from COVID, where we've had many things thrown at our economy, some things slumping, some things being progressing. What areas do you think we will see the economy feature in this election cycle? What policies would you like to see happen? Who do you think is going to carry that torch well?
Well, the two main parties, I would say the Liberals and the Conservatives. So Ford wants to be known as the yes premier. He wants to be saying yes to projects. He wants to be saying yes to the future. He wants to be talking about, moving forward. Del Duca and the Liberals are very much focused on, economic, so protecting the economy for the little guy, for the little person, and this idea of supporting them and this economic dignity. They released a plan around on economic dignity, I think about 4 weeks ago or something like that. So very competing visions on what kind of economy they would like to see. Too early to tell which one's going to resonate. I think, while the Liberals are trying to go after those left-leaning sort of middle-class voters, I think the Premier and his team are sort of saying, we are the team of economic growth. We've gotten jobs here. Count on us to be the ones to take you into the future to continue producing those kind of numbers.
Okay, and I take these points well. However, I'm thinking as we've emerged from COVID, there's been so many businesses have closed, and there are many entrepreneurs and many small businesses owners in Ontario. And hearing that, or the suggestion that, Premier wants to be known as the yes to the economy, I'm saying, but you've just been saying no for the past 2 years, for reason, like good reason or not. But that seems to be the talking point on that. Yianni, how would Premier Ford emerge as the yes Premier when he's been saying no?
I think the way Ford kind of bounces back from that is by introducing a recovery plan, a post-COVID economic stimulus program that invests government money into new projects, whether it be infrastructure, whether it be small businesses, whether it would be into education and other sectors of the government and the economy. I think at this point, similar to how some other premiers have said yes to jobs, economy and pipelines like Jason Kenney did in Alberta, I think Premier Ford's going to have to say yes to infrastructure projects, to say yes to increasing funding to education and healthcare further than what he did during the pandemic. So I think there's going to need to be a huge investment from the provincial government and Doug Ford's team into that respect.
Okay, let's talk quickly about this new policy that was recently announced by the Ontario Liberals, a handgun ban. So this to me came out of left field because I usually after we have like the summer of the gun or a lot of rampant gun crime, this will come up. But I don't believe that we've had that recently. So what's the impetus behind this? Any thoughts, Elliot?
Well, for Liberals, it's quite simple. Banning handguns or firearms or whatever you want to call it is extremely popular for Liberals, whether you're at the federal level or at the provincial level. It's a bit different in different parts of Ontario, I would say. I would imagine Northern Ontario little less down with that policy, and parts of Southwestern Ontario as well. But generally, for core Liberal voters, so I'm talking sort of GTA, things like that,
right,
very
urban.
popular.
Yeah, because urban voters, right. I mean, whereas you go to the rural parts, you might own a firearm for hunting or for something of the sort.
Right.
And I think the pushback from maybe the more conservative-minded voter is this a slippery slope? We start with the handguns, will it go down to my other firearms? So that might be the hesitation. Okay, we only have a minute left. I have to ask you this, Yianni, because we've seen that there are a lot of Ford superstars from his cabinet who are not running again. A lot, many. And, appointments are being made, not nominations. Why is this happening? Maybe you don't know why it's happening, but is this a good thing?
I mean, I obviously don't know why it's happening. I don't particularly think it's a good thing. I think it's showing that number one, Premier Ford's rushed and doesn't have a team ready for an election in time. But two, it also just shows that there's, this kind of bow down mentality within the party with individuals, being handpicked by the Premier himself or his close advisors themselves, which is something we certainly saw in the Patrick Brown era, and it didn't work out well from him.
Right, and I was definitely a vocal critic of that practice, wasn't I? Okay, well, that's all the time we have. We'll definitely keep an eye on this. Thank you both so much for joining me today.
Thanks, Tanya.
Thank you.
Well, with an election call expected any day now, we do know that the election date is fixed on June 2nd. And of course, here at Counterpoint, we will endeavor to bring you all the latest and the greatest from the trail. What will the result be? We don't know. We're still several weeks out. But again, we will give you in-depth analysis every single week. For Counterpoint, I'm Tanya Granick-Allen.